Hello and welcome to the Evolving Christian Faith Network videocast. My name is Bo McGuffey. I'm your host. I also go by the name Irreverence online, and you are now entering into part 3. And if you're not sure why it's part 3, check out part 2 and part 1. But you're now entering into part 3 of What the Hell Do We Do with Hell? Now, in the first episode, what I talked about was outlining more of a conservative approach to dealing with the problem of hell. And then in the second one, I took shifted a little bit further into a more moderate or a more traditional approach. And what we saw with the conservative approach is that there's a regurgitation. This is the way it's always been explained and so we're saying this is just the way it is, and well, if you don't understand it, welcome to the club, because we don't understand everything. It's just the way it is. There are some theologians who tweak that a little bit and say, yeah, there's a problem with this idea of God as love and eternal hell, so we're going to say that hell's maybe not as eternal, or there's still an out. And that's more of a conservative approach. The more moderate or traditional approach is to say, well, this is the language we've used all this time, and we know that there is a problem here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the old language, the ancient language, the traditional language, and we're going to redefine it without breaking it away from its old meanings. In other words, we're saying it's not that the tradition was wrong, the tradition's right, it's just that we're making it more right than it was by sort of what we're doing. And part of what I said at the end of that last episode is that I really don't think that the problem is ultimately about having theological concepts and working with them, but as much it's really about the problem we're running into is the process of dealing with these concepts. We've looked at the conservative approach, we've looked at the traditional or moderate approach, and now what I want to do is I want to take us into where I'm coming from, which is more of a revisionist approach. Now, I recognize that, and I understand, I do believe the previous approaches, and I can say that part of the reason why I understand is because I was there at one point, but now I'm not there any longer. I recognize that this traditionalist approach that we talked about last time, this traditionalist redefinition of terms, really is what has been happening throughout Christian history. It's just sort of the way it is. I recognize that that tradition has served its purpose throughout time and space, and it's worked quite well in the past. But I also believe that this redefinition is not part of the solution, but rather this redefining Christianity is part of the problem. And instead what we need to do is we need to reinvent it. Now, what does it mean to reinvent a tradition? Well, first of all, I think it means that it's important to recognize that there is indeed a tradition. We have to start with that. We have to wrestle with it and try to figure out what was going on with that. What is going on with the tradition? Reinvention has to come out of a strong dialogue with that which was previously invented. This means that the reinvention process will include a series of affirmations, and this is the good stuff that we find in there, as well as a series of rejections. And this is the crap that we're just getting rid of. Keep in mind that a theological system is a network. It is a network of interlinked theological concepts. And so when you are reinventing a single theological concept, it's going to have an effect on everything. And when you start the process of reinventing, you have to ask, what is the issue being addressed by the traditional language? In the case of hell, the issue is, what do we do with those who sin? Ultimately, I see the concept of hell as functioning in a specific way within Christian theology. I believe that it is a force for empowering a boundary with divine will. If you cross that boundary, there will be consequences. Imagine being inside of an electric fence, if you will. There are two parts. There's a fence, there's the electricity. The fence itself is a boundary, okay? The fence is saying you're not supposed to go on the other side of the fence. The problem with fences is that they can be hopped, and I know because I used to do this when I was a little kid. I don't really hop over fences anymore because I could fall. But back then, didn't care. Just hop over, go do whatever you're going to do, hop back over. No harm, no foul, right? Well, the fence is there for a reason. It's to keep the boundary from being crossed. And, you know, if you're hopping fences, then obviously it's not working, right? So one solution is to electrify the fence. And so it is the electricity that then becomes the power to maintain the boundary. Okay, so if I'm outside and I'm playing in a field surrounded by an electric fence, I know where I can and cannot go. If I'm running around and playing and I'm not getting shocked and having fun, then that's like receiving a great big, yes, you're doing it right, from the owner of the field. If I get shocked, however, that's like receiving a great big no. So theologically speaking, if one believes that creation is a good thing, then life itself draws forth a divine yes, that's like playing in the field. But for life to be vital and good, there are boundaries on that field of play. And when the boundary is crossed, the divine yes turns into a divine no. That boundary, what is the boundary? That boundary comes in the form of divine law. Okay, this law has two parts. We're talking about the tradition, right? The law has two parts. Love the Lord God with all your heart and mind and soul, love your neighbor as yourself. Or as Paul summarizes the law, and I love the way, this is like my favorite quote in the entire Bible, but basically he puts it this way in Romans 13, verses 8 to 10, if you want to look it up. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment, all summed up in this word. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. So, theologically speaking, hell is the consequence for those who transgress the law. Just like the shock is the consequence for those who transgress the boundary of the electric fence. Okay? Same basic thing. This is the theological function of hell. To empower the established boundary with divine will. Now, alongside the importance of its function, we have this related question, and that is to say, who gets to enforce this boundary? Or to put it another way, who gets to be judge? Because we're talking about a law here, so legal terms are good. But anyway, I think is something that's often missed when people are talking about hell. When we move the concept of judgment into the mythical realm, okay, it removes all human, mortal claims to having any authority whatsoever to judge. Okay, so any authority to judge has been removed from the human realm. Human beings have no right then to judge any other human beings. And so this is all so often just glossed over. It's also very important within the concept, because hell is not about empowering the law with human will, but divine will. So only God gets to be the judge. Okay, now that in a nutshell, okay, what I've just said, that in a nutshell is my basic understanding of what the concept of hell does within the matrix of Christian theological concepts. And now that we have established a certain basic understanding, it's time to go on and it's time to ask ourselves, so what do we do with all of this? This is sort of a traditional understanding of what's going on and my understanding of how it all functions. What do we do with this from a revisionist perspective? Well, first, we accept, and this is hard for many people, but we accept that the concept, the mythical concept of hell is outdated. It is mythological language that spoke to a pre-modern world, but it really doesn't make sense in our more scientific worldview. And that means that we simply need to get rid of that language. We're not eradicating it from the tradition as if it were never important. Rather, we accept that it is a part of the tradition and an important part of the tradition. But we also accept that it's time to just let it go. And having done that, once we've done that, we can then ask ourselves, is there any language in our world today that addresses the issues of boundaries that should not be crossed by human beings, if they are indeed meant to live in love? And I would say yes, we do. I would say that the most readily usable language that I can think of is the language of justice. Yes, it just so happens, by the way, that the language of justice is also ancient language. While that does indeed happen to be the case, it is completely irrelevant to me, okay? I don't care whether the language is ancient or not. I am not interested in replacing one ancient language with another or getting rid of the language because it's ancient. The question for me is ultimately, does it work in today's world? And I do believe that the language of justice just so happens to be the kind of language that does. So we want to start working with that. Now, as we start to talk about changing language, there's something that we also need to consider, and I suspect that this is probably the traditionalists' greatest beef with this approach. When you change the language, you're cutting loose the anchor, the tradition, okay? That means, you're getting rid of the pitfalls of the old language, but you're also losing a lot of the benefits as well. If we drop hell and instead we pick up the language of justice, I believe what we get out of it is we remove an initial barrier to being taken seriously. I mean, eternal hell, scientific worldview. Really? I imagine that most people in today's world are not going to be as offended, whether emotionally or intellectually, by the concept of justice as they will be the concept of eternal hell. So there's some good things we can pick up there. In the swap, however, we lose a certain bit of external motivation to not do those bad things that we really shouldn't be doing. A lot of people are motivated internally, but not everyone. And for those who need this external motivation, I doubt that they are going to be as worried about facing justice than they are about facing an eternity of torment for doing those very bad things they shouldn't have been doing in the first place. Justices could be bad, but eternal hell? That's like forever, ultimately bad, right? So I think we do lose a little bit of that external motivation. So given that you do get benefits, but you also lose stuff, changing the language, it's not something that we should do lightly. You want to be intentional about it. You want to have a good understanding of what you're doing and what you're really pursuing. So anyway, so how do I then, as a revisionist, put all this back together? Okay. Well, I'm going to take three concepts. Remember, the theological concepts are interrelated, so if it's like pool balls, you hit one, it affects other things, and you've got to account for all of that. But I'm going to take three theological concepts, and I'm going to try to draw them all back together. Love, boundaries, and justice. I want to start with the idea that God is love, and that the divine law, above all laws, is to love one another. I believe that love has both a positive and a negative pole. I'm not sure which is my left and right here. But a positive and a negative pole. Well, I know which is my left and right, but I don't know what's showing for you. So anyway, doesn't matter. On the positive side, we're going to say this is the positive side. Love is that connection that happens when we identify with another. So when we identify with another in some way, there's an emotional attachment. When something happens to that person with whom we can identify, we can say, I feel your pain, and we can mean it. When people identify with each other, there's a certain resonance between them that allows them to share life in this deeper way. And this resonance, that is the positive pole of love. Now, the negative pole of love is that of boundaries. When I was in high school, our band teacher had on her office window a poster. I can't remember what the image was exactly, but I do recall the poster words, and it says, if you love something, set it free. If it comes back to you, it's yours. If it doesn't, it never truly was. It's all over the place. I've seen this in other places, but I recall it primarily from my band days. But this is what boundaries are all about. Personal freedom. Respecting the boundaries of others is about respecting their freedom to be and to become. Respect for boundaries is a manifestation of love. When we love someone, we don't try to control them. And here I'm not talking about children, keeping children from running out into the middle of the road or anything. I'm talking about adults who are responsible for their own behavior. When we love someone, we don't try to control them. So that's the negative pole, boundaries. So then, love does two basic things. First, it calls us to identify with those around us. And second, it establishes the boundaries for how we relate to each other, primarily around personal freedom. Which then brings us to the law of love. Laws are not meant to enforce that positive pole. This is the positive pole, but the negative one. If we are attentive to laws, they might identify to us where they would like us to go, but they don't force us to go there. They establish sort of the low bar, and the high bar is what you want to shoot for, but they don't force us to go for the positive. Instead, what laws do is they actually prevent us from unraveling the desired goal. Like, the goal is this, to completely unravel everything. That's the laws keep that unraveling from happening. For example, okay, let's just jump to an example. Think in terms of speed limits. 35-mile-per-hour speed limit in a residential area, okay? Ideally, okay, on the positive pole, okay, speed limits serve a certain function in society. On the positive pole, if you will, the ultimate goal, is to get people to drive responsibly. It's that simple. The point of a speed limit is to get people to drive responsibly. It's ultimately what the law is trying to promote. However, when the rubber hits the road, what the speed limit law actually does is prevent the irresponsible, unsafe behavior. The reason why the speed limit is 35 in the residential zone and not 65 is because there are children playing, there are adults, there are pets out. Things can happen. And so you want people to drive responsibly, but a sign that says, drive responsibly, probably is not going to work as well as speed limit 35. Okay? On the positive pole, drive responsibly. On the negative pole, don't go there. Okay? That's your boundary. So that brings us all of that finally brings us to the question of, that 35-mile-per-hour speed limit sign, that fence, what happens when the law is transgressed? Okay. Well, this one's running long, so we're going to have to wait for next time. Again, my name is Beau McGuffey. Thank you very much for spending time with me on the Evolving Christian Faith Network videocast. And if you want to know more about a revisionist perspective, then please check out my blog at evolvingchristianfaith.net. And also consider the possibility of checking out my book, Drinking from an Empty Glass, Living Out of a Meaningless Spirituality. I hope to see you for part 4. And that's the last part, so hope to see you there. And until next time, peace.